When I was a young man, about 18 or so, my friend Scott asked if I wanted to help strip out this house prior to it being demolished. I jumped at the chance, figuring I could use the extra cash. So me, Scott, and a couple other guys started working on the house, clearing it from top to bottom. And I was paid about $30 a day, back when $30 was actually worth something. I was assigned the basement while the other guys worked on the ground floor and attic, which didn't bother me. I liked working alone. The basement came as something of a surprise. There were easy chairs down there, a moth-eaten sofa, a small broken-down refrigerator, and a massive collection of Time magazines stacked in one corner, with dates going back to the late 60s. And squatting in front of the sofa was this really old pre-digital TV set. It was huge and ugly, like a great big box sitting on 4 wooden legs. The entire basement smelled of mold and sour milk and prehistoric vomit. Because I figured it would help the time pass quicker, I switched the television on. It took a few seconds to power up, and when it did, there was some kind of 80s game show playing. I knew it was the 80s because of the clothes people were wearing and the style of the hair. The sound was pretty garbled, and the quality of the broadcast was hit and miss, but I remember the host. He was a large man with a huge, almost cartoonish chin, like he was wearing some kind of prosthetic or something. He was the original Lantern Jaw, and he wore this ridiculous tweed suit that strobed pretty badly as he moved around the studio. The contestants were equally weird-looking. There was this woman with real birds nesting in her beehive hairdo. They'd start singing every time she got a question right. It was a gimmick, of course, probably concocted to make the show stand out in a crowded schedule. But still, that woman's eyes were freakish. They were slanted at a really weird angle, and she blinked in sudden, rapid clusters. Another guest, a middle-aged man, was dressed in a uniform of a major with the U.S. military. He was even more freakish than the woman because his entire lower jaw was missing. His face literally ended with his top row of teeth. It was some kind of war injury, and the major used a voice amplifier to communicate. It was hooked into his throat and made him sound like a robot. The other guests were a mixed assortment of strange and totally fucked up. A young man wearing black sunglasses with an eye painted on each lens. An old woman with false teeth that kept taking out and polishing against the sleeve of her blouse. Whenever she took her teeth out, her cheeks would cave in a ridiculous extent. I couldn't believe this shit. Pretty soon, I had forgotten all about work, and I was crouched in front of the television, watching the show with a growing sense of disbelief. It was like they'd raided the local freak farm. I turned the volume up as high as I could go, but the sound quality was crap, and it was still an effort to hear what was going on. I figured the host was called Mr. Pontiac because his name kept flashing up on the screen, but for some reason everyone on the show called him Mr. P. It took a while to realize there were actually 2 Mr. Pontiacs. I think they were twins, or else they were made up to look alike. One version of Mr. Pontiac was cheerful as fuck. He kept laughing and joking, and he'd perform this weird little dance every time someone got a question wrong. The other version of Mr. Pontiac seemed perpetually pissed off. He never smiled, never joked, and at one point he seemed on the verge of hitting one of the contestants. He wore a tie, whereas the cheerful Mr. Pontiac wore a large striped bow tie. Other than that, they were both identical. I never quite figured out what the object of the game was, but the guests kept winding up in some pretty weird predicaments, like standing in a huge tank and stomping on thousands of live roaches, or running around this enclosure trying to snap the heads off squawking chickens with a pair of garden shears. It was insane. not even cable would carry shit this extreme. But for some reason, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. It was like watching a slow car crash. That first day, I completely forgot what I was doing there. I just sat on the old couch and watched this show. It never ended. It didn't cut to commercial breaks. It just went on and on. I could hear my friends working away upstairs, and occasionally they'd shout at each other. But they sounded far away, not really part of my reality anymore. I had this uneasy feeling that kept growing inside me longer I sat there. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the set. I felt compelled to answer the questions, trying to beat the contestants' time. I'd start repeating all the game show slogans, and I'd get really mad with the contestant if they flunked a task. I was becoming emotionally committed to the outcome of the game, and I still didn't know what the game was about. Scott's voice ricocheted down the stairs. "Hey, Nicky boy, what the hell you doing down there?" I gave a start and quickly switched the set off. "I'm working my ass off," I called back, checking my watch. I realized almost 2.5 hours had passed. Strange, it only felt like 5 minutes. I hadn't even started clearing out the basement. I got home later than usual that evening. My girlfriend Jessie tried to tell me about her day, but somehow we wound up getting into a huge fight. I felt really agitated for some reason. Everything pissed me off. The sound of her voice, the way she arranged her hair, even the goddamn color scheme of the living room. I couldn't believe I'd let her get away with this shit so long. I wound up sleeping on the sofa. I googled the game show on my laptop. Mr. Pontiac, Mr. P, nothing. No mention of it, which made no freaking sense. The show had a pretty big budget, and it was extreme enough to have registered on someone's radar. I mean, how many game shows feature the slaughter of live chickens, for crying out loud? But, like I said, there was nothing. Zip. I tried to get to sleep, but I kept seeing images from that show. Every time I dozed, the most grotesque visions would come oozing into my skull, terrifying me so badly. I'd physically jerk up off the sofa and stare wildly around me. At last I grabbed my clothes, took a carving knife from the kitchen, snatched up the car keys, and drove out to that house. I don't know what made me do it. It was like I was being compelled. All I knew was that I had to get back to that house, to that basement. I had to carry on watching that show, and I vaguely remember Jessie screaming at me as I left the house. She must have thought I was nuts. I had a spare set of keys, so I parked a little way down the road from the house, walking the rest of the way and letting myself in. In the basement, I switched the TV on and sat on the sofa. The room was almost entirely bare. The TV and the sofa were the only things left. The game show was in full swing. The contestants looked even more surreal than they did this morning, if that's humanly possible. Exaggerated features, bizarre mannerisms, several of them resembling human-animal hybrids. One man with a left eye that bulged hideously out of its socket. A woman with only half a head, the other half lost to some gruesome accident. And there was a tall, thin guy with boils swarming his face that regularly burst open and leaked pus. The games were just as extreme as before. One game required the contestants to eat live maggots out of plastic buckets. Another had them tiptoeing across the floor covered with primed bear traps, whilst a third game forced them to navigate a primary colored room filled with an assortment of lethal-looking booby traps. I tried to convince myself that no real blood was being shed, that the lady with the missing nose wasn't really decapitated in the third elimination round, or the guy with the muzzled-shaped mouth didn't really lose a leg, but Jesus, it all looked so real, and the audience was baying for blood. Mr. Pontiac screaming with laughter every time someone suffered an injury, or howling with rage every time they made it safely through a round. And I found myself screaming and howling along with him because the game was everything. Because the game was the only thing. Slowly but surely, I began to realize that the contestants were all dead. that this was some kind of horrific afterlife, and the two Mr. Pontiacs were aspects of the same demonic entity, but I couldn't tear myself away. I felt like my soul was slowly being sucked into the game. I couldn't remember who I was before I started watching, and it seemed my every waking hour since birth had been consumed by it. "Yes, sirree!" Mr. Pontiac shrieked at me out of the television set. "You really want to come over with our side of the screen, Nicky boy? Play for some real stakes, Come on, Nicky boy!" the audience roared. "All you gotta do is man up and end your miserable life." Mr. Pontiac drew his thumb across his throat in a sudden slicing gesture. "It'll be over in a second, and boy, have we got games for you." "Man up, Nick!" the audience thundered. "Take your life," Mr. Pontiac suggested. "Take your girlfriend's while you're at it. She'll thank you for it." It made sense. I held the knife I had brought with me, turning it over and over in my hand. Christ, it all made so much sense. The game had no beginning and it had no end. The game was all there was and all there would ever be. I raised the knife to my throat, grinning as the audience chanted, "Man up, Nicky boy!" A shadow fell across the room as someone stepped between me and the television set, and suddenly the screen was shattered by a heavy blow. Instantly I was on the ground, flailing about and gasping for breath. I felt as though I had been drowning and someone had reached down and dragged me out of the water at the very last moment. When I had sufficiently recovered, I looked up to see Scott standing in the basement, staring down at me with a workman's mallet in one hand. "What the fuck were you up to?" he demanded. "How did you know I was here?" "Jesse called me," he said. "Told me you left the apartment with a knife, yelling something about a basement." He shrugged. "So I figured you must be coming here." He crouched down beside me, and once again he asked what I had been doing. I stared at the destroyed television set, a gaping hole where the screen had been. "Did you see it?" I demanded. "Did you see the game show?" He shook his head. He told me that he had seen me through the basement window. I was sitting on the sofa, hunched over with my hands clasped together, laughing and cackling and cheering at the top of my voice, completely entranced by the television set. Strange thing was, Scott said the set wasn't even switched on.